Welcome to Auburn Community Television in this episode of Meet the Artist. Meet the Artist is supported by the North Auburn Artists to introduce artists in our local community. Today our guest artist is Mary Pivetti. I am so excited that Mary has invited us into her studio because Mary brings such fabulous watercolors to our art community. She just moved here a few years ago, and I will tell you she has such an asset as an artist, but also what she has contributed to the art community. Because of Mary, we now have Art Walk. So let's welcome Mary. Mary, it is so good to see you, and we thank you so much for welcoming us into your studio.
Thank you, Lucinda. I really appreciate this opportunity.
So what I would want to start out with is just generally talking about how you got into watercolor. I know that you told me earlier that you also did other mediums, and you are exploring a bunch of other stuff too, so we can talk about that as we go through today.
Okay.
But let's start with, so what is it about watercolor that drew you to it, and just generally your background?
Okay, thank you. I didn't actually start with watercolor. I started with oils, but they were pretty toxic 30 years ago. So I switched over. And I was going to go to acrylic because that's the closest to oils. But somebody told me, and this was the thing that switched me over, was, don't do watercolors because they're really, really hard. And I'm like, oh, well, I think I'll do watercolors then. And they are really, really hard. So I laugh because my technique is loose because I can't control it. It's not something that I necessarily developed. It's just I'm trying to control the medium, and sometimes I like the lack of control in it, which is nice.
It causes you to focus a little bit more about to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Right.
I know when I was reading about how to do watercolor, and I was actually amazed, is that it talks about how the paint actually rolls over, I think the top of it rolls somehow on that piece of water. And I just thought, and that's what you're controlling, is that roll of the paint on the water. And I thought that was such a cool explanation of why this is such a difficult medium.
Well, it rolls on the water when you do a wet on wet technique, but if you do a wet on dry, it sucks it up because the paper, the good paper is 100% cotton. And so it does not roll when it's...
Also interesting, because I didn't know that there's a wet and a dry different. So can explain that a little bit. Is that so you've actually put moisture onto the paper? Is that what you're doing before for the wet, when you're using the wet?
Right. So some people partition off certain parts of their page, get that wet, work that area with the wet on wet, then move somewhere else, either dry on wet. And dry on wet is you just start with the dry paper and you go in with your wet paintbrush. Wet on wet is you get the whole thing or portion of it wet, and then you go in with a wet paintbrush.
Oh, no, that's interesting. So is it easier to control it in one way versus the other?
If you like hard lines, which I am hard line adverse, then dry on wet is better and easier. Wet on wet is very loose.
Now, when you start as well, do you do a wash over the back on the? Would that be the wet on wet is when they're doing the wash, or is that you let that dry if you're going to be doing the dry? I'm sorry, because
that's okay.
Okay.
Most often I'll do a background first, and that'll be a wet on wet, and then I will build up layers, which is called glazing. So if you go wet on wet again, you're putting a glaze on that back color, and watercolors are transparent. So if you put a yellow down, and then you put a red on top of it, letting them dry between each step, then you will get orange because the colors are transparent. So so these glazes that you put over, sometimes 10, 20 glazes in different areas, then you build up different colors.
Well, now let's go back a little bit then too when you're talking about your background. So I can understand then why moving from oil to watercolor, it does seem like a very natural segue to me, because it seems that you're doing a lot of the same things.
Not really, because
okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
With oil, you start with dark, it's opaque,
Right.
and you build up to light. With watercolor, since it's transparent, you start with light and you build up with the dark. In oil, you can like make textures and bumps, and with watercolor, there's nothing to scrape off. You can scrape and make certain techniques, but you're not scraping up gobs of paint.
Yes.
You know, you're just making texture on the paper that the paint will catch.
So this was a major change.
It was a major change for me. But I loved it because of the ease that I could put it away real quick. I had children, and oil, you don't just put that away real quick. You know, it has to stay and dry, and with watercolors, it's dry within, depending on how thick of paper you have, it's dry relatively quickly. So it's more child-friendly.
And cleanup would be a little bit easier, I would think, with the watercolor.
It is. And it's less toxic, so if the kids get into it.
So you talked about 30 years ago, so you've been doing this for a long time.
I have, but I took a break between when I had my kids, so about a 20-year break. And I did art, but I did it with my kids. So I started an art nonprofit with a friend of mine, and we wanted art to be in the school system again, like it was when we were younger. So we put together Fraser Mountain Focus Central, and we had after-school classes and summer camps, and so all my creativity was focused more on teaching the kids art and bringing it to the community than doing it and selling it myself. I mean, every once in a while I would dilly-dally, but it wasn't a focus because I was working as well.
Now, you're retired at this point, and so you now have all this time that you can do your art, and you are exploring a lot of different things within the watercolor medium, because we were talking about all these different things that you can do in it. So if you can kind of go through and talk about like salt, scraping, splashing, it sounds like actually a lot of fun.
It is. It's a lot of fun. So in order to get real thin lines in watercolor, it's very difficult to paint them. I mean, you can, but I have a hard time. So I end up scratching the paper to get lines. The pigment sinks into the line and makes a harder line than everything around it. And so I use scratching a lot. Salt gives it lends to the atmospheric effect. It looks like a icy morning or a sparkly sun on water, which is hard to duplicate to actual paint that. Ice on windows, you can use saran wrap. You paint, you smash the saran wrap down, you let it dry, you pull it up, and it looks like glass shards. Flicking the paintbrush, if you want flicks of, let's say you're doing a pumpkin and you want flicks of little specks on your pumpkin, you can paint them, but it's a lot harder than just flicking. You know, so you take a paintbrush and you flick it, and you get that effect. Splashing water does the same thing as salt does, but it's a less vivid.
When you say salt, are we talking about actual table
salt?
Okay.
Table salt. I mean, you can use different types of salt. You know, the bigger the grain, the more of effect you're going to get. The smaller the grain, the more salt, the more it's going to look like sand as opposed to, you know. But yeah, so a lot of painting in watercolor is not actually painting at all. It's just using different techniques to get the different look that you're going for.
I think the overall is the painting. It doesn't make any difference what a lot of people always think, well, you have to have a paintbrush to be painting. And I think, no. It's a lot more than that. Well, we have some examples of some of your work.
Okay.
And so let's talk about those.
All right. Thank you.
Now we're going to take a look at some of Mary's paintings, and she's going to show us some of the techniques in the actual work. So let's start with the one that I'm holding here.
Okay.
And you can talk about, I love your color choices to start out with. They're
Thank
just
you.
so beautiful.
This is actually the first painting that I'd ever used teal. So I do like this painting, but I used a toothbrush to flick these little spots on here. So it's just an old toothbrush, and instead of a paintbrush, you know, I just flick it, and the specks are smaller than if you do use a brush.
Basically, in your household, anything's fair game for your art.
Anything.
I always love that. That's part of the creative process. So let's look at this next one, because you were talking about these earlier, and I think this is fascinating.
So this one right here, I didn't actually paint anything. It started out as a wash, and then I scratched in the lines. So all of the actual things that look like they're painted are scratches.
Now this is another one I find really fascinating, and I don't know if you'll be able to pick up the texture that's been caught in this particular painting, but you can at least explain how you achieved this texture.
Okay. Any artist out there knows that framing is very expensive. So I have been experimenting with these cradle boards, and so I just paste the picture onto the cradle board, and usually when I'm going to use this technique, I use a picture that I'm not happy with, you know, something that I feel I messed up, and so I glue it on with Elmer's glue. It's totally non-archival, and scrunch up tissue paper, flatten it back out, pat it on it, go over it with glue again, and call it a day.
And you end up with this absolutely great texture to it. I love it. And I love the fact that you're repurposing something that maybe wouldn't have been a piece of art before. So
Yeah.
it's great. Now you have a story behind this next one. I will hold it for you.
Yes. So this is the salt technique that I was talking about, and these salt specks were a more granular piece of salt than just regular table salt. So you can see the difference. I will show you table salt on the demonstration that I'm doing, but this is more like rock salt. But you can see how it pushes the paint away, and it looks like an icy morning or a sparkly day.
Now the other is the one that caught my eye when I came into your home. And so I specifically wanted to show it because I think this is just beautiful. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this painting?
Okay. When I first started painting watercolors, I just did trees. And then I started getting bored with trees, so I started doing trees monochromatically. And I would do a purple study, then I'd do an orange study, then I'd do a pink study, a green study. Well, this was my purple study, and it was one of the very first paintings that I did, and it was the very first time that I did something this large. So it was one of my first paintings, and my children have claimed it, so I can't sell it.
Well, and I think this piece would definitely sell. It's so beautiful. I love just all have you the shadowing and the trees behind, and I do like the use of the one color. Now you said that you go through moods in using colors.
Yes.
So this was kind of a purple period that you were going through here?
Yes, this was my purple period. I had my purple period actually came about because of a trauma. So when you see all the purple, which all the things that you just showed had purple in it, it was kind of a big period. But I gravitated towards purple. Mm-hmm. Right now I'm in my orange period, so everything's orange.
Which is fitting given the fact that we're in the fall.
Right, exactly. But my periods last longer than seasons, you know, more like a year or so. I went through a period of steampunk, which is completely opposite of any of this. And I was making 3 things a day, and I was just so driven. And then a year and a half into it, I'm done. Never again. But I keep coming back to watercolor.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is your constants, and you do it so beautifully.
Thank you.
And now the most exciting part of this show is that we are going to have Mary give us a demonstration on how she does and uses all of these techniques. So stay tuned for that.
So today I'm going to do a demonstration on fall pumpkins. And I'm going to demonstrate how to do the salt technique first. So I'm going to start with wet on wet, which is basically just I'm painting water onto the top of the page. And I do not care if I have white spaces left, which means spaces where the paint did not, or the water did not go. Then I'm just going to basically drip this paint on here and do a wash. So this is called a watercolor wash. And the idea is to be lighter up at the top of the page and darker around my pumpkins. Because salt works better when you have a darker, more concentrated pigment. So now I'm going to go back in and drop a little bit more dark around the edges. Now, salt only works when you have your paper a certain level of dryness. And I had an instructor, her name was Sonia Hamilton, and she would say that when your page glimmers just the right way, that's when you put the salt on it. I still don't know what that glimmer is because it always looks like a glimmer to me because it's wet, but you know, we're gonna go with it. Okay, you'll notice I've got some white space here. I've got some white space over here. I'm not going to stress. And now I'm going to put the salt on it. I'm not going to just salt the whole thing. I am going to put it in my hand and sprinkle it.
So what exactly does the salt do then to the paint?
I'm not sure what the chemical reaction is, but it pushes the paint away so you can see whatever color is down. So if I would have done a wash of a different color first, let it dry, then done it again, it would push away the top color and show the bottom color. So this has to percolate now, and while I'm working on that drying, I am going to work on the bottom of my pumpkin.
Now, do you usually switch to the different colors in the different areas as quickly as you're doing today, or do you let it dry a little more?
The reason why you go quick with watercolor is because it does dry. Now, if you use 90-pound paper, it's going to dry very quickly. If you use 140-pound, not as quick. This is 300-pound paper, so for today's purposes, it's not really ideal because it takes the longest to dry, the 300-pound. The reason why you want it wet is because the watercolor will move around and you can manipulate the paint a little bit better than if it's dry on wet. So on the bottom, I'm just going to loosely get that wet again. And I'm going to go in with some different colors of green. And notice here, I'm not painting. I'm just dabbing colors on because I'm going to let it do that watercolor wash that I love so much. So I have a break here, basically of dry paper. Dry paper will stop the paint. I do not want my green to go into my blue. I want my sky to be separate from the shadow of the pumpkin. So I'm going to drop in some orange pumpkin reflection down here, just a little bit.
So do you usually do your
wash.
backgrounds and everything first then, like you're doing with this one?
You know what, I don't have a usually, really. This one, the reason why I do it like this is because these are totally separate from each other. And I kind of want them to dry before I get into my pumpkin, because I don't want my pumpkin to bleed into my sky. It may, but okay, so I'm going to add just a little bit more color here, and then I'm going to show you how I scratch to get hard lines.
Before we had spoken about having a favorite paintbrush,
Mm-hmm.
and you were lamenting that you had lost your favorite paintbrush. And today you're actually working with one that you're not that happy with.
This paintbrush is so cheap. I mean, it's like literally, I don't know, $5, if that. But it's got a good point on it. So I'm going with it. But I do have favorite paintbrushes, and I stick with them. I have, you know, wads and gobs of paintbrushes, but I only use 4 paintbrushes. So I'm just going to kind of wash this around a little bit more. And then I'm going to scrape. And my scraping technique is not very complicated. I turn my brush around, and wherever I want a line, I just scratch. And the paint sinks into these lines, and it gives me some definition where I wouldn't get it otherwise. But it's not such a hard line that that it's jarring.
So you're basically creating kind of a groove that it's going into.
Yes, for the paint to sink into. And I do want the darkest colors around the pumpkins, so that's why I'm moving the color down. And I'm going to do a little bit more dark around the pumpkin. I'm adding some blue because I had put yellow in before. Blue and yellow is green. So I'm getting all different types of green going on here.
Now when you do the grooves, do you see a difference from the weight of the paper in terms of the success or failure of getting the groove in it? Because one's a little bit softer, isn't it?
Yes. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry. In fact, can you ask that question again? You're going to have to cut this, obviously. What was the question?
About the paperweight.
Oh, okay, okay.
Does it make a difference in doing the grooves?
Okay. So the paperweight, where that makes a difference, not necessarily in the grooves, but I wouldn't be able to pick it up and do this. I would have to tape it down if it were any lighter of a paperweight, because it will buckle. So that's one reason why I like the 300-pound papers. I don't have to tape it. I don't have to baby it. You know, you can scrub out things on the 300-pound paper where you can't on a lesser grade paper, because you'll get like balls. You know, if you rub paper, how you get kind of balls, and the lighter weight paper will do that. So I like the fact that it doesn't roll on me and I don't have to tape it down. Okay. Now, one thing I said is I didn't want my green to go into my blue, but look here what's happening when that does happen. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, you know, you want to control the look that you're going for. If you want a bloom like that, then, you know, create a bloom. I'm going to leave it. I think it's nice. I'm going to put some more blue in the leaves because I don't have a lot of contrast. And then I'm going to start working on the pumpkin.
Now, you had indicated that you go from light to dark when you're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So if after you get it all finished and you're looking at something, you could still go back in after it's dried and maybe do a little bit more dark work on the piece?
Yes, you can, and that's called glazing. So if you go over certain colors, you're basically glazing over the colors. So I can go back later and add different layers, but the look that I usually go for, which is the atmospheric kind of fuzzy look, it doesn't have hard lines. So the more you go back, the harder your lines get. So I kind of want to try to control it so that I don't have to. Okay, so with watercolor, you start with light on the bottom and you work up to dark colors. Oils, you start with dark and you work up to light colors. So on the pumpkin, I'm going to start with yellow, because if you think of pumpkins, they're orange. And what I'm going to do, instead of just painting orange, I'm going to go in and paint with red and yellow to show you what I mean by the transparency. I'm going to leave a lot of white space because white space is my friend. One of my mentors and instructors, Juan Pena, he always says, your darkest darks go against your lightest lights. So I've got this blue here next to my yellow, and then I'm going to be preserving some white because I want your eye to go to the pumpkin and then around. So I'm going to just yellow, yellow, yellow. Notice I'm not painting very delicately. I'm just kind of, and I've got some blue over here that I don't necessarily want, but we're going to have to just deal with that. Okay, now red. And I'm going to actually do the red on the lines, because if you think of a pumpkin where the sun don't shine, that's where the shade is, or the shadows, and so that's where the darkest red is going to be. And because my paper is still wet, you notice that it's kind of flaring. It's not staying where I actually painted it. It's just kind of blossoming.
Sometimes the paintings have a mind of their own.
They really do. And when my paintings have too much of a mind of their own and I don't like what's going on, what I do is I cut them up and I make note cards and I make coasters, and so, you know, I try not to worry too much about it not working, because I can always turn it into something else. Okay, so one issue that I'm having because I'm going fast is I'm getting blooms around my blue sky. But that's okay.
Well, we appreciate the fact that we are in a kind of a different environment for you, so we appreciate what you're doing for us.
Oh, no problem. This is fun. I mean, this is, you know, this is what I do, so you're not putting me out too much. Okay, so I'm going to go right here. So what I'm doing right now is actually a glaze, and you'll be able to see how I kind of get harder lines here because this paper is already dried.
So as you're going along, you kind of have to work with what the paper and the paint is doing. So here you told me you were kind of a control person, but this seems to me you kind of have to go with the flow.
You
Literally.
do. You literally have to go with the flow. However, the more practice you have, the flow gets easier. You know, it's not always completely difficult. And now I'm going to go in with some orange because I don't have time to let each layer dry and build up. So I'm going to just force the issue. One thing that Juan Peña always wants us to do is paint with just 4 colors. Actually 3 colors. So I don't know if you've ever done anything with just 3 colors, and you know, it's quite the challenge.
I don't know if I could do that. As you said, I don't have specific color periods, but I will find a color that I really, really like. So like right now I love magenta.
Oh.
So magenta is finding its way into everything I'm doing. Not as the dominant, but it's definitely there. So if I was stuck with just 3 colors, my magenta would end up having to be off to the side.
Well, the thing with those 3 colors is that every color under the sun comes from those 3 colors, and so it forces you to really practice your color theory and make color swatches. I mean, I've got color swatches all over the place, you know. So when I do a picture beforehand, I'll think, you know, what colors do I want? Like, there's a picture that I want to paint for my front breakfast room, and I want to have it predominantly yellow and gamboge and orange. And so I'm going to have to make the colors from those colors that I want. And then I have to remember how I made those colors. But he's really forcing me to look at color differently. You know, before if you look at my palette, I have every color under the sun here. And that's how I used to paint. And now with him, I have a palette over there that has 4 colors in it, and that's how I'm painting now. And it's just so different, but it's so interesting to me. Okay, the paper's wet. I'm going to go in and I'm going to scratch these pumpkin lines. Scratch, 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 scratch. And then I'm going to, I want to show you what this salt looks like, because the salt is doing its thing here. See how it pushed away the color? So it looks almost like it's in the morning, right before harvest, and the ice is just melting off things. And notice, if you will, my paintbrush, I'm not really painting lines per se. I'm just dropping in color, and I want it to do its bleedy thing. If I try to control it too much and paint too thin of lines or too specifically, then I'm going to have problems. Okay, now I'm going to do the flicking with a brush because I don't have a paintbrush here. I mean, I don't have a toothbrush. And I'm going to just flick so my pumpkin doesn't look so perfect. And then I'm going to go back in on the bottom and add a little bit more green around the bottom, the base of the pumpkin, because remember, darks against lights. Okay. And I have a color paint that I just love. Actually, my friend and I love this color, Ginger Barrett. She's a fellow artist, and she's the one that actually got me into all of this. I was just going to do it for my own enjoyment. She's like, no, Mary, let's do the plaster artist tour. And then, of course, once I committed to that, I had to paint more because I didn't have enough, you know. Okay. And then I am going to paint a line right here.
Now, that is the thing about the tour. It does force you to stay at your easel.
Focus. Focus, focus, focus. So you can tell with this line that I painted right here, it is much thicker than the lines that I scraped in, and that's because I had to paint it, because there's no water over here. There's nothing I can scrape into. And then I'm just going to add a little bit more yellow to make the orange pop. Okay, so this basically is my fall pumpkin.
That's wonderful. You know, so appreciate you showing us how you do this, but I also love the fact that I'm going to move in here with you.
Okay.
But I love the fact that you have shared with us is how your venture in learning how to do all of these different things. And even though you said that you've been doing this for 30 years, you're still taking classes?
Mm-hmm. I am.
And
I love them. Especially the plein air, you know, going outside with
Right.
Juan and Ginger, and it's just so fun.
I've always just kind of steered clear of that. I guess I just feel nervous about it. I don't know. I like controlled environments. I think I'm more of a control nerd than you are. You know, one of the things that, since we're doing the pumpkins, I think I'm going to segue a little bit into, because you don't only do the watercolor, you try all different things. And that's one of the things with the tour that is coming up, which we'll be talking about a little bit more, is that you will be able to see a lot of these different things that Mary does do. But let's give you a sample today. And one of them is you're venturing into gourds.
Yes, fall, pumpkins, gourds. And so a medium that I like that gives kind of a watercolor feel is alcohol ink. And so this is alcohol ink. So not only do I paint with it, but I also carve into the gourds and then do things with them later. Like I'm going to make this into a night light. So the light will shine through the flowers. So I'll have a candle inside.
Okay, but this still has all its stuff inside.
That's a juicy green one right now.
Okay.
I can't carve into these.
Okay. So
it has to be green.
Interesting. So you have to start like this, and so you do all the outside first.
I do the carving. This one I didn't. This one I dried it, cut the hole, painted it, called it a day. Mm-hmm. That one, before I cut the hole, empty it out, I carved the outside, and basically I just peeled. I used a stencil. I traced it with an X-Acto knife, and then I peeled off. It's kind of like peeling a potato. Mm-hmm. You know, it's very thin. And now I'm going to see what it does.
Oh, so all of the green and this is such a natural aspect. It just brings that too with the flowers that you've put on it.
It's not going to be green. This is
it's not.
No, this is what it's going to look like.
Sorry.
It's going to look like this, but not as wrinkly.
Oh, see, okay.
Okay, so where I scraped. I like the green. Yeah, I do like the green better, but we don't always get what we want.
Oh, okay.
So where you scrape off is where it's light. Where it's dark, mm-hmm. That's where all the green mottled is.
That's after it's dry.
This is after it's dry. But the reason why this one shrunk up and puckered is because I hollowed it before I scraped it. I lived and learned, so this one I'm not going to hollow until it's dry.
Now, if you just decided just to leave it like this so it would stay green,
it won't stay green.
It would just rot?
It won't rot. It'll turn hard like this, and it'll look like this.
It still does.
The daisies will be white. and the green skin will be brown.
Well, I guess we can enjoy the different timings of it. It's just like all of us. We start out looking really good, and over time, we not so much.
But I like this one, and I'm going to keep it.
I love it. And I see it, and I understand it. It's just like, I just love this green, and I love the light green that's within it. But I guess I'm in love with the gourd.
So the story about this gourd is I drove all the way to Roseville to get 4 gourds. And they were green like this. And the lady said, "Oh, so what are you going to make with it?" And, I thought she meant crafts because obviously, right? So I'm like, I'm going to carve them and I'm going to paint them and I'm going to make birdhouses and planters and bowls. And she's like, "Oh." And I said, "What do you make with them?" And she goes, "I make soup." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, no, I don't cook."
We all come to it with different perspectives, right. Definitely. That's great. So you were talking about how you use work that you're not that completely happy with and then what you do with it. And this is an example of what you do.
Thank you. So I went through a phase. So I not only go through color phases, but I go through phases like trees. So I went through a phase a while ago of cows, and I was trying to nail a cow. I just wanted to paint a cow. And so I started off with fence posts, and then, tried to drop cows in. I could not do a cow for the life of me. So I cut the fence posts out and made coasters. And then, some flowers, and this was I had a commission to do a lake house. A friend of mine that I went to high school with, and I nailed the sunset, but the house not so much. So I cut the house out, and we've got a sunset. So I also make cards. If there's a bigger spot that's nice, and so nothing is wasted.
Well, as you said, one of the things that we're doing right now is getting everything ready because we do have a tour that comes up. And it is usually the 2nd and 3rd week in November. Mm-hmm. And you will be showing with
Ginger Barrett. Our location is 63 and 64 in the tour book.
Yeah, so if you're looking for going on the tour, these are out. They're at all the businesses. They have all of the artists in it. It has a wonderful map at the beginning, in the middle of it. And so you can find all of us, and you can find Mary. So Mary, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way? Either through...
I would say my phone number, but...
Do you have an email?
Yes, let's do email. It's Mary Pivetti at yahoo.com. MaryPivetti at yahoo.com.
And do you have a webpage?
I do not have a webpage, but I have an Instagram. So it's Mary_Pivetti_art. And that's Instagram. And a Facebook as well.
Now, if people want to stop by and see your work and other times besides the tour, are they certainly welcome to give you a call or send you an email?
Sure. Yes. My work right now is at Roper's Jewelers, some of it. But that will be coming down in a couple weeks because the art walk is now wrapping up. And then I will be doing the Placer Artist Tour so they can see it there. And then in December, both my work and Ginger's work will be up in the City Hall Gallery. So,
and is that for any type of is it just your own show that you're doing there?
It's my own show and Ginger's.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Lucinda.
And I also want to thank you for tuning in to Auburn Community Television to see Meet the Artist. Meet the Artist is certainly one of the ways that you can discover if you have an artist living near you, or possibly you're discovering the artist within yourself. I hope to see you again.